Social Studies 30-1, the Holocaust. So this would be an extension of our look at Nazi totalitarianism and some of the results of Nazi totalitarianism. So just think back to that set of notes. We looked at the rise of Hitler and the Nazis um, up through the Enabling Act, in which he became the absolute leader of Germany, and then the gradual devolution of freedoms for rights and Jews. Nuremberg laws passed in the fall of 1935 stripped them of their citizenship rights. And so you could say then that the Holocaust would be the next step in the devolution of what happened to the Jews in Nazi Germany in the 1930s and 40s. The Holocaust means death by fire. The definition of the Holocaust would be uh, the robbery and murder of some 11 million people, 6 million of which were Jews in Germany in the 1940s. The goal of the Holocaust was to cleanse Germany of unwanted, undesirable peoples, including uh, Jews, the Romani, mentally handicapped people, the disabled, and so on. So it wasn't something that only happened to the Jews, but they were far and away the largest of the groups affected by the Holocaust. You could call this a genocide. It can be referred to as an ethnic cleansing. Um, it's a really good example, like just a very extreme example of what can happen when a society rejects liberalism under totalitarian rule. This would be the culmination of things going wrong in a totalitarian regime. When people lose rights and freedoms, when a government is above the rule of law, you could argue that society is very vulnerable and prone to human rights abuses, and it gets no worse than mass murder. And that's what we're talking about is a mass murder of Jewish people. Understand that genocide is a very old tool of conflict. It's been around for a long time. The Holocaust is not the only example of a genocide. There are many more. These are just some. The Roman sacking of Carthage in 146. Carthage was a city-state sacked by the Romans in 146 BC. That could be deemed as a genocide or an ethnic cleansing. One of the more unknown ones was the genocide of First Nations peoples in North and South America. Uh, Millions died due to smallpox and government programs to get rid of them. The Armenians at the hands of the Turks just in the early 1900s, Cambodian killing fields in 1979, Kurds at the hand of Saddam Hussein in 1991, ethnic Albanians in 1993, former Yugoslavia, of course, the Rwandan genocide that you probably learned in grade 11 in 1994, maybe even the current Sudanese genocide or what's going on with Rohingya in Southeast Asia. Any of those are genocides. There's been lots of them, but probably the Holocaust was the most organized and calculated of the genocides. Common question is why the Jews? And we learned yesterday that totalitarian regimes pick a scapegoat to blame society's problems on. The Germans picked the Jews, and there was reason for that. The Jews were already a minority group in Germany and all of Europe. They were already marginalized. They were a people without a home. Um, the Jewish diaspora is a term given to the scattering of the Jews. On several occasions, the Jews had been driven out of their homeland, which is present day Israel. And so a group of people without a homeland and are scattered about exist in small, marginalized minority groups. And it's easy to pick on them and go after them because they have no safe refuge. They're kind of sitting ducks, I guess you could say. As late as the Middle Ages, Jews were often the target of witch hunts. They were scapegoated at that time too. They looked different. They spoke a different language, different religion. They didn't conform. They didn't fit in at a time when you had to conform. I mean, the Middle Ages is the epitome of conformity, and here you've got a group of people that just didn't fit in the eyes of a lot of Europeans. So a lot of them were scapegoated as early as the Middle Ages during the witch hunts. Um, 1930s, late 1800s, early 1900s was also a time of very apparent racism globally, a lot of good came out of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution. Um, the Enlightenment gave us, after all, democracy, gave us capitalism, gave us the principles of freedom, of liberalism, of rights and freedoms, liberty, and so on. But there also came with it a dark side to the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, and that was the notion of scientific racism or social Darwinism. A lot of people believed that if we could use science to prove things in nature, if we can use logic and reason to develop society and government and economics, why can we not use science to categorize race and put races on a particular hierarchy on the planet? And being that it's the Western Europeans by and large doing this, Western Europeans would go to the top of that racial hierarchy, um, Caucasian peoples, and they would gradually work their way down from the top of that hierarchy into what they would call subhumans. So they're beginning to categorize race based on what they think is science, but it was never provable. Because the concept, of course, is ludicrous that you could categorize people based on race. Um, they're believing that certain races are more intelligent than other races, and certain races are superior than other races. There's no scientific evidence to back any of that up, but that was the dark side that I talked about coming with the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution. So when the Nazis arrive in the 30s, they don't invent scientific racism and anti Semitism, but rather they just capitalize on something that had already been there. So social Darwinism, scientific racism was a method used by the Nazis to solidify their power, but also give focus to the scapegoating of the Jews. You've probably heard of the Aryan race, the Nordic race. It was a mythical race the Nazis were trying to bring back. The race probably never even existed. But that notion of the blonde hair, the blue eyes, the Aryans being stronger, smarter, and faster than most people was something the Nazis were trying to recreate in Western Europe and especially Germany. And the focus of their scapegoating became the Jews, um, anti Semitism. There is a myth circulating as well that's equally as ludicrous, the Dolchstoss myth. It basically said that uh, Jewish generals fighting for Germany in World War One, which they did, sabotaged the German war effort in World War One. And because of the sabotaging, that's why Germany lost the World War One, was exposed at the Treaty of Versailles, and then suffered the consequences of the Treaty of Versailles, the reparations, demilitarization, and so on. Again, the idea is ridiculous, the Dolchstoss myth, but it was a myth that would have been widely circulated in the 1930s to, again, um, get people to go after and scapegoat the Jews. A timeline of the Holocaust, the mass murder. As we learned, it started gradually. There was a boycotting of Jewish businesses, and then the civil service law, and then finally the Nuremberg laws, which forbid Jews to own things, to own property, and strip them of their citizenship rights. Jews were branded with the Star of David. They had to wear the Star of David on their sleeve so they could be recognized by the Nazis and Jewish citizens. Before the Holocaust, the Jews were rounded up and ghettoized. Ghettoization is something that they did, and some regimes will do to uh, groups of people they don't want. They herd them up, they make them live in a certain part of a city until they decide what they're going to do with them. And at the beginning of the ghettoization, the Nazis aren't quite sure what they're going to do with the Jews, but they do ghettoize them. So when they do figure it out, transportation and the execution of what they're going to do can be done more efficiently. Eventually, they do settle on the final solution, and this is stuff that I'm sure you learned about last year in 20-1, grade 11. Um, Eventually, they decide on the death camps, the final solution in January of 1942. And then they build some 6 death camps in Eastern Europe, and they've decided they're going to gas them and they're going to burn them, hence the Holocaust. These camps weren't liberated until the winter of 1945. Methodology early on was very crude. firing squads, killing them with axes, sending dogs. Very gross stuff. Don't want to talk about it too much. But then once they do come upon the final solution as we know it, they're using Cyclone B gas, which was actually a pesticide designed for locusts and things. And that's the methodology they're going to use to kill the Jews. You probably learned that last year too. By the way, a lot of this was done under the guise that they were moving Jews to a Jewish state that they can consider to be their homeland. Um, I think they passed that myth on just to get them to get on those trains quietly and efficiently without there being some kind of rebellion. Pictures from Auschwitz, the biggest of the death camps. At its peak, Auschwitz was murdering and processing 1,000 Jews a day. There's a picture of uh, a gas chamber. There would have been dozens of gas chambers like this. Crematorium to burn the bodies, complete with train tracks to push them up on a trolley. Um, Gross, disturbing stuff. The camps were liberated in 1945. The Soviets were the first to come upon these camps, and at first they don't even know what they are. I mean, this kind of things on this scope had never happened before. There was nothing to really compare it to. There had been rumors as early as 42 that this was going on, but most people just didn't believe it or wouldn't believe it. As the Soviets drove the Germans back out of the Soviet Union from the east, they came upon these camps, and eventually the Americans would come upon similar camps. And one thing they did do was they took a lot of photos and video. They wanted evidence of what was going on. They've decided what they're already going to do. They're going to put the Nazis on trial for crimes against humanity, and they want as much evidence as possible. Uh, Thankfully, they liberated the camps when they did, because already they had eliminated 65% of Europe's Jewish population. It could have been much worse if they didn't got there when they had. Nuremberg trials would come soon after. They take high-ranking Nazi officials and they put them on trial for crimes against humanity. And this was one of the first occasions in history where you couldn't just say, I was only following orders. That didn't always get you off the hook at Nuremberg. Other examples of crimes against humanity, um, American massacre of the village of Mili in the 1960s, Slobodan Milosevic in the former Yugoslavia, perpetrators of the Rwandan genocide of 94, and Saddam Hussein was killed by his own people for crimes against humanity. In all, in 1945, 22 high-ranking Nazi officials were put on trial for crimes against humanity. 12 were condemned to death, 7 sentenced to prison, and 3, believe it or not, were found not guilty. The conundrum was who do you blame for this? I mean, a lot of people could and did say they didn't know, and they probably didn't. But how do you really know if someone knew about it or not? By 1949, 99 others had been tracked down. A lot of them fled to the four corners of the earth, but most will probably go unpunished. Tough to track down. Maybe they've died of natural causes of old age in the meantime. From time to time, they do discover Nazi war criminals, and a lot of them are turned into the authorities, and the Israeli Mossad, among other organizations, will track them down and bring them to justice. So there you go. By the end, 6 million Jews had been killed in the Holocaust, 11 million people in total. A very extreme example of mass murder and what can go wrong in a totalitarian regime when a government is above the rule of law. People's rights and freedoms are often the expense of that, and mass murder is as extreme as you can get when you lose rights and freedoms.